Hello there, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to another reading, a new book, a new project we will begin and work through, and a new author also that I've never mentioned on the channel before, but of course, a member of the Gurdjieff community and has written many books on many subjects. And I read this text many years ago, as many of the texts that I share at the channel. Some, of course, I read regularly and like to review once every year or two. And some I haven't read for some time. So this is one of those. Kenneth Walker was educated at Cambridge and at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He qualified again as a surgeon in Buenos Aires in 1913. During the First World War, he served as a captain with the Royal Army Medical Corps and investigated wound shock, travelling back from the trenches with badly wounded men. He gave the first blood transfusion in the trenches. So quite the character, quite the figure. He's a consulting surgeon and has published a number of books on medical and physical subjects, including Venture with Ideas, which I've dug out, and we can go on to that if we enjoy Kenneth's way of writing. The Unconscious Mind, the Conscious Mind, and the Making of Man. So that's all I'll say by way of introduction. In the playlist, and just from a few days ago, I did a more in-depth video where I read the preface, the blurb, and also some more information about Kenneth Walker. And he studied with Gurdjieff for 40 years and was a man active in life, very much embracing the fourth way ethos of being active in the world. The world is our arena in which to do the work. We don't need to change anything. We don't need better conditions. We don't need new friends or a bigger house. We just need to do the work where we find it, which ultimately, all of us being together, is right where you are. Wherever you're watching this, whatever is occurring tomorrow, whatever are your commitments from day to day, that is where the work is to be conducted. And here at the Four Ideals, we will continue to read these wonderful texts, to be together like this, reading them. And I suppose I like the word fellowship. Fellowship is a nice word, and you can take that or leave it. But for me, I do feel sort of, we're here together. We're here together reading these works, and it's a wonderful thing. Of course, you guys are welcome to read them on your own, and maybe you will. But it's lovely to have you all, and I hope everyone's as excited to read this as I am. And we will read 2 chapters tonight. Man's Several Minds is the second chapter, and of course Gurdjieff and Ouspensky is the first one, and likely Kenneth, or I should maybe call him Mr. Walker, like he's my mate Ken. Kenneth Walker or Mr. Walker will likely share. And it's a wonderful cover, actually, a wonderful front piece with the Enneagram there, front and center, and a wonderful title, A Study of Gurdjieff's Teachings. And just one more comment before we begin. It's a study of Gurdjieff's teaching. So whether you're new and this is the first video you've come to and found on the Four Ideals, or maybe you're here live watching, that's okay, because as it says, it's a study of Gurdjieff's teaching. This book is in a sense an overview and a survey of the ideas. So if you're new, it's okay, because you're going to have a survey and a study, an overview. If you're very familiar with all the ideas, that's okay too, because we just go over them all again. You can never go over them enough, as Maurice Nichols says. Valuation and understanding of the work, the ideas, the man Gurdjieff you could even include. That's what's important, and that's what we're ultimately working towards. But enough of introductions. I will say before we get into the comments and chat, if you're excited for everything coming up at the channel, there is an Enneagram series. I don't know if I said any ads. No, I didn't say any ads. I said Enneagram. There's an Enneagram series, an in-depth dive studying the symbol of the Enneagram coming up as well soon. So lots going on here at the Four Ideals. So if that's all interesting for you, like and subscribe. Share the show with all your like-minded friends, if you're lucky enough to have them, of course. And I'll just say hello to everyone. Hello there, Zach. Are you still in Spain or are you back? And hello there, Zach. Nice to see you. J.K. Techers, my friend. Long time no see. J.K. Techers says, good evening, Lewis and all. Great to be back listening to the live reads. And it's good to have you back, J.K. Techers. And I hope life's been treating you well. And yeah, welcome back. Lynn Elliott says, hello, everyone. Jordan's here, says, good evening, everybody. Letitia, I believe that is. Tell me if anyone I'm mispronouncing your name wrong or you'd prefer to be called something else. I'm happy to accommodate. I'm going with Letitia. Good evening, everyone. Stephen Lahn from Cairo. How's Cairo? How's the weather? And welcome, Stephen. Reppin Cairo in Egypt. And I believe that's Nikos. Good evening to Nikos. Good evening, everyone. And with all that, let's begin. A study of Gurdjieff's teachings by Kenneth Walker, Chapter 1, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. Forgive me again. I need some WD-40 on this arm. Chapter 1, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. It is fascinating and at the same time rather alarming to look back along the line of the past and to note how thin was the thread which the fates spun and how easily it could have been broken, and if it had been broken, then one's life would, of course, have been quite different. How little I guessed that when a young Russian journalist on the night staff of a St. Petersburg newspaper made a journey to Moscow in the spring of 1915, he was initiating a sequence of events which was eventually to be of the utmost importance to me also. What? I should have protested, had a clairvoyant gypsy drawn my attention to this. What on earth have a St. Petersburg journalist's movements got to do with me, the resident surgeon to the British hospital in Buenos Aires? There seemed to be no connection at all between myself and any events occurring in Russia, and many things had to happen and many years had to flow past before the path of the stocky young Russian journalist with the cropped hair and the strong glasses crossed that of the Buenos Aires surgeon. And it's a wonderful opening statement, isn't it, about all of the interconnected connections, synchronicities, meetings, chance, glances, or things that we overhear that go to create this present moment where we are. Again, I'm sure you all can think back to your first encounter, whether it was at Lewis Kirk channel or Book Club channel or now the Four Ideals channel, you know, that first, as Kenneth Walker saying, that fateful moment that we connected and now here we are. And again, one can give any relative degree of importance to that. But I would say it's very important, as I rambled about in the introduction. Ouspensky, because of course that's who the young Russian journalist with the cropped hair and strong glasses, that's who it is. Ouspensky tells us in his book In Search of the Miraculous that during this said visit of his to Moscow in the spring of 1915, two friends, a sculptor and a musician, spoke of a small group in Moscow which was engaged in certain investigations and experiments which were difficult to describe. They worked under the direction of a Caucasian Greek and, rather against his will, he agreed to be introduced to their Caucasian teacher. The meeting took place at a small cafe, and Ouspensky gives the following description of his first encounter with Gurdjieff, and here is a quote from In Search of the Miraculous. Quote, I saw a man of an oriental type, no longer young, with a black moustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man with the face of an Indian Rajah or an Arab Sheikh, seated here in this little cafe, in a black overcoat and a velvet collar and a black bowler hat, produced this strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you, because you see he is not what he pretends to be, and yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. End quote. And again, that's from In Search of the Miraculous. And welcome back, Zach. The weather's starting to perk up and turn, so you timed that nicely. They met together several times at the same cafe, and Ouspensky began to realize more and more that the man to whom he was talking here in Moscow, this man who spoke incorrect Russian with a strong Caucasian accent, was possessed of the kind of knowledge for which he, Ouspensky, had recently been seeking without success in India and Ceylon. It was the beginning of a 7-year close association between the two men of great importance to them both. Again, as documented in Search of the Miraculous on the channel. Then came the war and the revolution, which brought to an end not only the old Tsarist regime, but also all thought and culture in Russia. In 1917, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, with several other members of Gurdjieff's group, were refugees in Constantinople, but they were as far from being any concern of the writer of this book as they had always been. Then the thin thread of events began to draw them nearer to me. There were influential people in England who had read Ouspensky's book, Tertium Organum, and who, on hearing that its author was one of the many Russian refugees stranded in Constantinople, invited him to come to London. The next significant event took place right on my doorstep at 86 Harley Street. We have been granted an interview with the Home Secretary in 20 minutes' time, and I want you to be a member of the deputation. It was my friend, Dr. Maurice Nicoll, who said this, and without giving me time to answer, he bundled me into an awaiting taxi. And so, how exciting, hey, to be there in 1917. You know, a friend or familiar acquaintance of Nicoll and Kenneth Walker, and these mystical figures coming into the world. And again, I would argue that it's not really that different today, isn't it? There's many millions, billions of people in the world who don't know who Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are, or maybe they have heard of them and are completely uninterested. And you can imagine, can't you, many other people in England around that time who heard of these guys and were like, you lot are crazy. Why are you wasting your time with these, well, I don't know, whatever they might have called them. But what's it all about? I inquired after having been introduced to the other members of the deputation. About Gurdjieff. We have to get a permit for him to come to London. Ouspensky is already here, and we want Gurdjieff as well. You are to represent orthodox medicine and to say how important it is that Gurdjieff should be allowed to come here. Half an hour later, I found myself explaining to a bored Home Secretary how essential it was to the welfare of British medicine that Gurdjieff, who was only a name to me, should be granted permission to settle in London. But the Home Office explained next day that it had already granted so many permits to white Russian officers that it was unable to issue one to Gurdjieff. Excuse me. So, Ouspensky settled down in London and began holding meetings there, whilst Gurdjieff remained where he was in Paris and eventually established in a Fontainebleau chateau what had for so long been only a project in his mind, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. Maurice Nicoll was responsible for the forging of the last link in the long chain of events which had started 8 years previously with Ouspensky's fateful expedition to Moscow and his meeting with Gurdjieff. He buttonholed me one day at the corner of Weymouth Street and Harley Street and told me that Ouspensky was now holding very interesting meetings in Kensington and that he had obtained permission for me to attend. He explained that it was by private invitation only that people were allowed to come, and left me with the impression that I could consider myself very fortunate to have received an invitation. Wednesday next at 8 o'clock in Warwick Gardens, he concluded, and disappeared. And how wonderful that Maurice Nicoll is an absolutely pivotal character in this story, because he's the one who's brought Kenneth Walker, Ken I call him, Mr. Walker, to meet Ouspensky. So it's wonderful. I have told the story of my meeting Ouspensky, of my close association with him for over 30 years, and of my subsequent encounters in Paris with that still more remarkable man, George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, in a previous book. I imagine that to be this one, Venture with Ideas, which again we can get on to after Views from the Real World. Oh, he's even saying, all of these events of great concern to me and of sufficient general interest to warrant their being put on record were recounted in Venture with Ideas. But little was said in that book about the ideas taught by these two men, and it was the unique quality of their teaching, even more than their characters, which bound me to them for so many years. So we're doing it the other way around. We're doing the ideas first, and then later on, if you like, we can do the sort of autobiographical stuff. Ideas are not always passive, submissive things which we can lay aside when we have no further use for them, and this was particularly true of the ideas which I obtained either from Gurdjieff directly or else by way of Ouspensky. They were ideas heavily charged with energy, and they soon began to work in me like some powerful ferment. Attracted to them originally on the grounds that they were unlike anything that I had previously come across, they gradually took possession of me and propelled me in a direction in which at first I had no desire to go. Unlike Ouspensky, who had deliberately abandoned his work in 1914 in order to search the East for what he called esoteric schools, I was, or believed myself to be, content with things as they were. In short, I had no need for a philosophy of life. Yet here was I being jerked out of my usual rut of living and my customary channels of thought and feeling, not so much by the impact of two powerful men, remarkable though they both were, but by the sheer weight of their teaching. All these things are explained in Ventures, or Venture with Ideas. Gurdjieff was in Paris and Ouspensky in London, and so it was from the latter that I learnt the system of knowledge which Gurdjieff had brought back to Russia from his years of wandering in the East. And it was perhaps as well that the fates who were responsible for all that was now happening to me arranged it thus. Gurdjieff used strong medicine, and I doubt whether I should have stomached his very drastic treatment had I met him at the beginning. And what a strong and important statement, and the difference between people that worked intensely with Ouspensky first, again very intellectual, metaphysical, all the ideas, and the people who met Gurdjieff directly first. Very interesting. Think the difference between, an Ouspensky book and a Fritz Peters book, the difference in the language and the terminology. But I'll just read that again. Gurdjieff used strong medicine, and I doubt whether I should have stomached his very drastic treatment had I met him at the beginning. I owe a great deal to Ouspensky for all he did for me during those early years, and I am deeply grateful to him for his patient and clear-headed interpretation of Gurdjieff's teaching. He had a much better command of English than had Gurdjieff, and a methodical and tidy mind which imposed order on the latter's less systematized method of teaching. His patience was remarkable. From 1917 onwards, he sought clearer and yet clearer formulations for the ideas he had received from Gurdjieff, with the intention, possibly, for he never spoke with certainty about this, of publishing them in the form of a book after the latter's death. But he died before his teacher, and it was upon Gurdjieff that the responsibility then lay of deciding whether or not Ouspensky's much revised typescript should be sent to a publisher. Gurdjieff had a Russian rendering of it read to him, declared it to be an accurate account of his own teaching, and gave instructions that it should be published forthwith. And there is, I can't remember if it's from Fritz Peters, or I can't remember the biography that we've read, maybe the De Hartmans, but there's a quote in there. Gurdjieff says, "Before I hate Ouspensky, now I love him. He write what I say." And that's about In Search of the Miraculous. And here we have another verification of its importance. Gurdjieff had a Russian rendering of it read to him, declared it to be an accurate account of his own teaching, and gave instructions that it should be published forthwith. And I've just read that again, and I don't know why I keep harping on and banging on about it, because I suppose it's clear, isn't it? Anyone who knows who Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are recognize the importance of In Search of the Miraculous. But I'm so fond of it that I do enjoy singing its praises, particularly when Mr. Walker shares a quote like that. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are now dead, and if I am ever to put on printed record what I learnt from them, it must be now. I have hesitated for a very long time before embarking on this task, and for a great many reasons. An important one was that I was well aware of the difficulty of putting into a book a teaching so individual as that of Gurdjieff, a teaching which, to be effective, cannot be read, but must be imparted to individuals by word of mouth. Gurdjieff believed that men and women are divisible into a comparatively small number of types, and that what is applicable to one type is not necessarily applicable to another. This being so, instruction has to be given individually, and it is obvious that this cannot be done in a book. I also foresaw the difficulty of presenting ideas first in the raw as I received them from Ouspensky, and of then showing the gradual deepening of my understanding of them as the years passed. This slow growth of understanding could only be suggested in a book by telescoping time, and the result of this might be confusing, so that the reader would often be left in doubt whether I was describing ideas as I had first received them from Ouspensky, or as I understood them much later on. This method of presentation might also require that I should sometimes have to put into Ouspensky's mouth words which he had never uttered, even although they were completely in keeping with his teaching. All this made it clear to me that I should encounter many difficulties in writing about Gurdjieff's ideas. Gurdjieff once said, quote, "I have very good leather to sell to those who want to make shoes out of it," end quote. And that's an analogy that Maurice Nicoll makes use of, and I think there's even a video on the channel about leather for life. If you search leather for life, you'll find it. And that's my commentary on that concept. And when these words came into my mind, they immediately gave me the right plan for the book. No better description than this could be given of Gurdjieff's role as a teacher. He was a man who had ideas of an extraordinarily high quality to sell to those who required ideas of this kind. Moreover, he had used the word sell deliberately because he always maintained that men never appreciated anything which they had not paid for. The payment need not necessarily be in terms of money, but something had to have been sacrificed if the leather they had acquired was to be properly appreciated. Another important point he made in this short sentence of his was that the leather was for those who intended to put it to practical use, and not for dilettantes or exhibitionists who required it merely for display. The buyer would have to make something out of the leather he had bought, and nothing could be more serviceable than a strong pair of shoes for life's difficult journey. I saw that the aim I should have to keep in view whilst writing the projected book was that of showing the reader the excellence of Gurdjieff's leather, and of then displaying the shoes I had made out of it. The workmanship and design of my new shoes could, of course, have been much better, but they have this at any rate to be said in their favour, that they are handmade, and my own work. As will later be seen, having given an account of Gurdjieff's ideas, I often compare them with kindred ideas obtained from scientific, philosophical and religious sources. These comparisons have been made because it has long been of great interest to me personally to compare and to contrast Gurdjieff's ideas with those I have come across in a somewhat varied reading during the course of the past 30 years. Think the 4 ideals, or 6, or 8, or whatever, but yeah, that's what I'm interested in also, so it's fascinating and very timely. Many striking similarities have been discovered in this way, but what I want to emphasize here is that nowhere else can so many ideas of this nature be found welded together into such a self-consistent and coherent whole. Or it would, perhaps, be better to use an entirely different simile and to liken Gurdjieff's system of knowledge to a living organism, in which every part is related to and dependent on everything else. It is because Gurdjieff's teaching possesses the qualities of coherence, integration and growth characteristic of life that I'm attempting to bring it to the notice of other people so far as it is possible to do this in a book. This last conditional clause is necessary for formulation and printing squeeze out of the spoken word almost all of its vitality, as pressing deprives a flower of nearly all its beauty. And what a brilliant sentence that is. I mean, I'm sure we're going to encounter many brilliant sentences, so please do forgive me if I repeat them. But I mean, that is quite special, isn't it? I'm going to read it again, of course. So you can always leave if I'm repeating too much, but please don't. This last conditional clause is necessary for formulation and printing squeeze out of the spoken word almost all of its vitality, as pressing deprives a flower of nearly all its beauty. The great religions have all been subjected to this devitalizing process. As taught by their great founders, they were beautiful, living things, but as later set down in books and scrolls by the scribes, the Pharisees and lawyers, they become as forlorn and as desiccated as are the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church. Unfortunately, there is no way of avoiding the devitalizing effect of books on oral teaching, and all that can be done in the present instance is to warn the reader that it is bound to happen. He must be put on his guard on another score also, to wit, on the use of the word system in connection with Gurdjieff's teaching. It is a term which should have been avoided had it not been sanctioned by long use. The reason for its being objectionable is that the term system is closely linked in our minds with such qualifying adjectives as correct and incorrect, orthodox and heterodox, and these are words to which Gurdjieff would have taken strong exception. They are words to which another modern teacher of spiritual truths also takes exception. Krishnamurti deplores our tendency to organize and systematize wisdom and illustrates this with a parable. He recounts how one day the devil and a friend of his were out for a walk on the earth when they noticed a man suddenly bend down and pick up something from the ground. The devil's friend said, "You had better be on your guard, for that man over there has picked up a particle of truth." The devil smiled and was not in the least disturbed. "It will make no difference," he replied. "They will organize and systematize it. There is no cause for worry." A joke, I suppose, that would be in the written word. Again, what word does he use? Devitalized. A devitalizing process of a printed joke. "He's picked up a particle of truth. It will make no difference," he replied. "They will organize it and systematize it. There's no cause for worry." The Zen Buddhist master likens all teaching to the pointing of a finger at the moon, and his disciple is very severely reprimanded if he places emphasis on the finger instead of the object at which the finger is pointing. So also must Gurdjieff's teaching be looked upon as a finger which directs attention to certain principles and methods which, properly used, lead to certain results. All that this book can do is to give the reader a notion of some of the methods and principles Gurdjieff used. To imagine that any book should achieve more than this would obviously be absurd. Gurdjieff did not draw diagrams on a board and teach from these. His method of instruction was far less comfortable to his class than this. He carved out from us living chunks of experience and taught from these. One found one's own petty vanities and follies being used as the specimens on which Gurdjieff was able to demonstrate to his class the mechanical nature of human life. A book is but a poor substitute for such vital and direct teaching as this, and it certainly is, but a substitute nonetheless, right? Without this book, we'd have even less knowledge and learning on Gurdjieff's teaching. So a book is a poor substitute, but a substitute nonetheless, and an important one, I would say, of course. My old channel was called Book Club, and we just read books, and we're still reading books, but now at the Four Ideals we're focusing on the Gurdjieff books, which I, to be honest with you, much enjoy. And so we're going to read this next chapter. It's rather long. So it's called Man's Several Minds. And of course, I imagine he's talking about the different eyes and the different centers. And then tomorrow we're going to read chapter 3, and that is Man is Asleep. And what's the one after that? Knowledge and Being. So tomorrow we will attempt to get through those two. But for now, this is the chapter 2, Man's Several Minds. To maintain a group's interest in an organism of ideas, to bring something for discussion every week, to guide people through their private confusions, stupidities and difficulties for over a quarter of a century was no mean achievement, and this is what Ouspensky did for his followers. And we, for the most part, gave him our staunch support. We were a motley crowd, held together almost entirely by the teaching. There were also people who came and went, the floating population of the work. There were its beach-comers, or beach-combers maybe, who wandered about on the edge of things, picking up odd trifles, but making no real efforts. There was the stranger who would turn up for a single meeting, and then, not getting the answer he required of Ouspensky, would come no more. And there were visitors who were already encumbered with so much mental and emotional luggage in the way of immovable convictions, theories, and firm beliefs, that it was quite impossible for them to find room for anything new. There were all these and many other types of people who came to a few of Ouspensky's meetings, manifested signs of disapproval, and then disappeared for good. But all the time there remained a solid core of followers who rarely missed a meeting. Ouspensky was holding his meetings at the time at which I joined his group in a house in Warwick Gardens. In the large ground floor room in which we met, there was a blackboard, some 40 straight-backed, hard-seated wooden chairs, and a small table on which had been placed a carafe of water, a tumbler, a brass ashtray, a duster, and a box of coloured chalks. At the table sat Ouspensky, a thick-set man with closely cropped grey hair, a man whom, judging by appearances, I should have taken to be a scientist, a lawyer, or a schoolmaster, but certainly not the exponent of what I understood to be a mystical form of philosophy. At first I found him very difficult to understand, chiefly because he spoke with such a marked Russian intonation that I had the impression that I was listening to a foreign tongue. But very soon I became accustomed to his Slavonic diction and discovered to my surprise that he possessed a very large English vocabulary. When talking to us he made little use of gestures or of the other aids employed by experienced lecturers, and this absence of art seemed to add weight to his statements. One felt that he had no desire to persuade one, as indeed he had not, and that what he said was sincere, reliable, and likely to be true. The bare room, the blackboard, duster, and chalks, the hard chairs, Ouspensky's appearance, the way he peered at his notes through and sometimes over his strong glasses, his dogmatic statements, his let's have no nonsense manner of conducting his meetings, and his curt dismissal of many questions as too long or useless. Sorry. His curt dismissal of many questions as too long or useless. All these things transported me straight back to the schoolroom. Can you imagine? Imagine asking Mr. Ouspensky a long question and for him to say, this is a useless question. I'm not going to answer it. You've been thinking about it all week, looking forward to the meeting. Oh man, this is deep. This is deep and powerful. Ouspensky will surely appreciate my deep, powerful question. And he says, it's useless. I'm moving on. I was a small boy again, listening to a kindly but rather severe headmaster delivering a talk to one of the lower forms. And although I was associated with Ouspensky for nearly a quarter of a century, our relationship remained as it had begun, that of a pupil, a prefect perhaps in later years, and his headmaster. I was never completely at my ease with him, and I never met or talked with him as one human should meet and talk with another human being, openly and without fear. That's rather honest and candid, isn't it? Nevertheless, I am deeply conscious of indebtedness to him and feel that I owe to him almost as much as I owe to Gurdjieff, for without Ouspensky's help, I doubt whether I should have ever understood Gurdjieff. Not that I claim even now to understand fully that truly astonishing man. Ouspensky's starting point for the study of G's system, he always referred to his teacher in this way, was that which G himself had selected as a starting point in Moscow, namely the study of the nature of man. He used as his text the words usually ascribed to Socrates, but which are actually much older than the age of Socrates, the statement that self-knowledge is the beginning of all wisdom. He then went on to say that we had an immense amount to learn concerning ourselves, for it was a subject about which everybody was abysmally ignorant. We were, in fact, very different from what we imagined ourselves to be, and attributed to ourselves all sorts of qualities such as inner unity, control, and will, which we did not, in fact, possess. Our work must begin, therefore, with giving up the idea that we knew ourselves and with discovering what we were really like. This was a necessary preliminary to becoming something else if, after knowing ourselves a little better, we disliked some of the things we had seen and wanted to change them. And, sorry to keep digressing, but that's quite a synchronicity for me there, because tomorrow we will read the penultimate of Maurice Nicol's commentaries on a man's relationship to himself. And that's what we've just read there, right? Self-knowledge is the beginning of all wisdom, and know thyself is the famous phrase that comes down to us, know thyself. And we will go deeper into that tomorrow afternoon, 2:00, I think, in the UK, if you're interested. I think a man's relationship to himself or something similar, but back to Kenneth. Then, without any more introductory remarks or conditional clauses or mention of extenuating circumstances, Ouspensky plunged abruptly into G's system of thought. Quote, man, he said, is a machine which reacts blindly to external forces, and, this being so, he has no will and very little control of himself, if any at all. What we have to study, therefore, is not psychology, for that applies only to a developed man, but mechanics. Sorry, I'm trying to find a bookmark. I think this one might have stickers on it. But yeah, and that's one of my Oh, sorry. That's one of my favorite quotes and passages from In Search of the Miraculous, when Ouspensky asks Gurdjieff, what he thinks about psychology, and he says, no, there's no psychology for machines, just mechanics. Ouspensky said that he would begin the study of man, the machine, with an investigation of his mind, and G's teaching on this subject differed from all other Western teachings. It proclaimed that man possessed not just one mind, but 7 different kinds of mind, each of which could make its contribution to the sum total of his knowledge. The first of these minds of man was his intellectual mind, an instrument which was occupied with constructing theories and with comparing one thing to another. Man's second mind was his emotional mind, which was concerned with feeling instead of with ideas. His third mind was the mind controlling his movements, and his fourth mind G had given the name instinctive mind. This fourth mind supervised all of the physiological functions of his body, such as the process of digestion and respiration. There was also the mind of man's sex life, and in addition to these ordinary minds, 2 higher varieties of mind, the higher emotional and the higher intellectual. And there's a wonderful diagram similar to Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, but there's all of the seven centers. These higher minds did not work in ordinary people like ourselves, but were active only in fully developed men. Yet they existed in ordinary people, and sometimes through some accident for a moment or two became active in them. The members of Ouspensky's audience, who had been brought up on the Cartesian idea that the mind was a kind of ghostly presence that made use of the central nervous system, such as a householder uses a telephone, that is to say, as an instrument for receiving messages from the outside world and for issuing orders to the body, found this idea that the body possessed so many minds a little confusing. I personally was not of the Cartesian persuasion, and I was particularly interested in the idea that there existed a special mind for coordinating the various physiological processes in the body. For how otherwise than by attributing to the body its own native intelligence was it possible to explain the marvellous work the body did, the complicated chemical processes which it carried out so rapidly in its laboratories, the astonishing cleverness it displayed in the regulation of its growth, the wonderful way in which it accomplished its own repair work, and the promptness with which it mobilized its defences against the attack of hostile microorganisms. These physiological marvels had always astonished me, and they suggested very strongly that the intelligence resided not in the brain but in all the living tissues of the body. Philosophically speaking, I had already come to the conclusion that the mind and body had to be regarded as coexistent and interdependent, each being a condition of the other's existence, and, as will later be seen, this philosophy is in harmony with G's teaching on this subject. I accepted very readily, therefore, this preliminary report that there were several kinds of mind in man, and that the body possessed its own physiological variety of it. Ouspensky made free use of diagrams when teaching us, and a diagram which was frequently drawn on the blackboard was the one showing man's several minds, as I shared with you in figure 1. He said that in this diagram man was regarded as a 3-storied being, in the top story of which there resided the intellectual mind, or as Ouspensky now preferred to call it, the intellectual centre. In the middle story was man's emotional mind, or centre, and in the lower story both his moving and instinctive mind, or centres. And hello there, Skyhawk. Hi to you, my friend, and I hope that you are well. When asked where, anatomically speaking, these minds or coordinating centres of man were situated, he answered that they were widespread throughout the whole body, but that the maximum concentration of the intellectual center, or what could be called its center of gravity, lay in the head. The center of gravity of the emotional center was in the solar plexus, that of the moving center in the spinal cord, and that of the instinctive center within the abdomen. Ouspensky advised that those of us who found this widespread diffusion of the various centers difficult to visualize should think of a man's mind in terms of functions or activities rather than in terms of centers and anatomical structures. Instead of talking about the 4 lower centers, they could say that there were 4 different functions in a man, those of thinking, feeling, and moving, and that of regulating the various physiological needs of the body. In addition to these, there were the sexual functions and the functions of higher thought and higher feeling, which were only latent in us and unable to manifest themselves. According to G, all living creatures on the earth could be classified in accordance with the number of minds or centers which they possessed, and man was the only creature on this planet equipped with an intellectual center. The higher animals possessed emotional, moving, instinctive, and sexual centers, but such lowly things as worms were devoid even of emotional centers and managed to get along with moving and instinctive centers alone. The relative activity of the 3 chief centers in man, intellectual, emotional, and moving instinctive, was different in different individuals, and this provided us with the means of classifying men under 3 or 4 headings. There were men who did everything by imitating the behavior of those around them, and who thought, felt, moved, and reacted much as everybody else thought, felt, and moved, and reacted. Such people were controlled almost entirely by their moving centers, which possessed the special gift for imitation, and a man of this type would henceforth be referred to as man number 1. Excuse me. There were other people in whose lives the emotions played a leading part, people who were guided by what they felt and by what they liked and disliked rather than by what they thought. Such people spent their lives in seeking what was pleasant and in avoiding what was unpleasant, but sometimes they reacted pathologically in the reverse way, extracting a perverted pleasure from fear and suffering and converting what was distressing into a horrid form of voluptuousness. Another wonderful sentence, but I won't repeat that one. An emotionally controlled person of this kind will be spoken of in future as man number 2. Finally, there was man number 3, the man who was swayed by theories and by what he called his reason, a man whose knowledge was based on logical thinking and who understood everything in a literal sense. A man of this third kind would be called man number 3. Sorry about this, my computer's come into life on its own, which is not good. And so we'll try and put an end to that. Let me know if it's still working okay. Where were we? Where were we? And who understood everything in a literal sense. A man of this third kind would be called man number 3. Ouspensky made it clear to us that no one of these 3 types of men was superior to any other one, and that all 3 stood together on the same level, equally at the mercy of their psychological machinery and without any will. All that this classification was meant to show us was that the individual behavior and decisions of one kind of man could often be explained by the predominance in him of one kind of function, and the behavior and decisions of another kind of man, and by the predominance in him of another kind of function. This method of classifying people was possible because human development was usually lopsided, and it was much less serviceable when a man's development had proceeded in a more balanced way. Okay, thanks Jordan for letting me know. Like I say, when the machines start doing stuff on their own. Gets a bit gets a bit scary, but we're back and everything seems to be fine. A properly balanced man working as he should work resembled a well-trained orchestra, in which one kind of instrument took the lead at one moment of the performance and another instrument at another, each making its contribution to the symphony being played. Unfortunately, it rarely happened that our centres worked harmoniously, for not only was one centre liable to interfere with the work of another centre, but it often attempted to do the work of another centre. There were occasions, for example, when our actions should be based on feeling rather than on thought, and other occasions when feeling should yield precedence to thought. But arguments often replaced feeling in the first instance, and emotions were liable to interfere with thought in the second instance. As the result of these disagreements between centres and of the absence of any conductor of the orchestra, discords were frequently sounded, our feelings contradicting our thoughts, and our actions being at loggerheads with both our thoughts and our feelings. We resembled, therefore, orchestras which not only lacked conductors, but which were composed of musicians who had quarrelled with one another. The players of the stringed instruments were no longer on speaking terms with the players of the wind instruments, and nobody in the least cared what the rest of the orchestra was doing. In short, each member of it did what he deemed to be right in his own eyes, without any regard for anybody else. Think of the man as a hackney carriage. Ouspensky said that to know oneself meant many years of self-study, and that we must first understand the correct way of doing this. He explained that he had started by giving us G's account of the different centres because we should find it of use to us in the work we were about to undertake, that of self-observation. What was now required of us was that we should begin to observe the working of the various centres in ourselves as they were functioning, and should assign to the appropriate centre each activity as we saw it. By obtaining our own examples of the working of these centres within ourselves, we should become more and more familiar with the working of our machinery. As G had long ago remarked, the study of man began with the study of mechanics and not of psychology, for psychology was applicable only to more fully developed people. To know ourselves in the way in which it was necessary for us eventually to know ourselves was a very ambitious aim, which could only be realized after many years of patient and painstaking self-study. He warned us against confusing self-observation as it should be carried out with that highly unprofitable occupation known by the term introspection. Introspection was very different from self-observation. What was required of us was that we should register or take note of our thoughts, emotions and sensations at the moment of their occurrence, and introspection usually meant only thinking and dreaming about ourselves. Introspection also entailed analysis and speculating about the motives behind our behaviour, but as our pictures of ourselves were to a great extent imaginary pictures, all this speculating and probing about in the darkness was of very little profit to anybody, so far as real self-knowledge was concerned. In observing ourselves, we must look at ourselves with detachment, as though we were looking at another person, about whom we knew very little. At first we might find difficulty in assigning our activities to the right centres, but with experience this would gradually become easier. For example, at first some of us would confuse thinking and feeling and sensing, and it would be helpful to us to remember that intellectual centre worked by comparing one thing with another thing, and by making subsequent statements on the basis of this comparison, whereas emotional centre worked by recording its native likes and dislikes and acting directly on this basis. Instinctive centre was similarly occupied with deciding whether the sensations it was receiving were of a pleasant or an unpleasant nature. We should bear in mind the fact that neither emotional nor instinctive center ever argued or reasoned concerning anything, but because they perceived everything directly, they returned to the perception an equally direct response. We should look upon these psychic functions of ours as being different kinds of instrument, each variety of which made its characteristic contributions to the sum total of our knowledge. And back to the orchestra analogy a moment ago. There were different ways of knowing a thing, and to know it completely was to know it simultaneously with our thinking, our emotional, and even with our moving and instinctive minds. Ouspensky warned us that while studying ourselves in this manner, we should come across many things which we disliked in ourselves, as well as many things of which we approved. But for the time being, we must be content only to note our likes and dislikes without attempting to bring about any change in ourselves. It would be a grave mistake, he said, and unfortunately a mistake almost impossible to make, for us to alter anything in ourselves at this very early stage of our work. To change something in oneself without running the risk of losing something else of value required a knowledge of the whole which we were very far from possessing. In our present state of ignorance of the whole, we might struggle to get rid of some personal quality which, properly handled, might at a later date become an asset to us, or else we might strengthen some other feature in ourselves which we happen to admire, but which would be a hindrance to our future development. Moreover, if a man were able to destroy some feature in himself which he happened to dislike, he would at the same time alter the whole balance of his machinery and thus bring about a number of unexpected changes in other parts of himself. It was fortunate, therefore, that it was beyond our present powers to tamper with ourselves, but possible only for us to see ourselves a little more clearly than we had formerly done. Ouspensky advised us to put all activities of a doubtful character aside until we had gained greater skill in the work of sorting them out. For the present, we should concentrate our attention on the classification of activities of a clear-cut nature. Then, after we had gained skill in observing the working of our various centres, we could begin the more difficult job of looking for examples of the wrong working of centres, due either to one centre attempting to perform the work of another centre, or else to one centre interfering with the functioning of another centre. He gave as examples of a centre doing the work of another centre, intellectual centre pretending that it felt, whereas it was quite incapable of feeling anything, or emotional centre coming to a decision which it was not within its province to make. He described the moving centre as a very clever mimic, and said that it often intimidated other centres working, making it appear outwardly that real thinking or feeling was going on, whereas in actual fact nothing of a genuine nature was happening at all. For example, a person might read out loud from a book or talk to somebody quite impressively, yet he might be only uttering words without any more meaning for him as he uttered them than the words spoken by a parrot had any meaning for the parrot. Reading, speaking, and so-called thinking on this very low level often occurred, and they were all imitations of other activities concocted by moving centre. And I hope he wasn't referring and thinking about me when he wrote this in 1957. Ouspensky pointed out that the ability of one centre to work for another could often be very useful in that it allowed of continuity of action, but he warned us that if it occurred too often, it might become a habit and thus be harmful. There were occasions, for example, when clear thinking was of vital importance, and if at a particular moment of clearer thought, emotional centre intervened through sheer force of habit and took it upon itself to pass judgment on a situation for which the reason was required, the result of its untimely interference would be extremely unsatisfactory. Man, he said, was a highly complicated and delicately adjusted piece of mechanism, and if the balance between the various parts of it were upset, the whole of the machinery began to work very badly. This sort of thing happened frequently in psychotic and neurotic individuals, that each center was continually interfering with the activity of another center, or else was attempting to do its work for it, and failing badly to accomplish it. As a result of all this interference and wrong functioning, everything in the machinery of the neurotic person was at 6s and 7s. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? No one says that anymore. At 6s and 7s. But badly working machinery was by no means confined to the people we labeled neurotic. Ouspensky said that although Western psychologists had recognized that wrong inner work and the interference of one psychic function with another psychic function were responsible for many nervous diseases, they had not yet realized how much faulty work went on in ordinary and supposedly healthy people. Wrong work of centers occurred in us all. It accounted for the dullness of the sensory impressions we received from the outside world, for our apathy and lack of understanding, for our inability to see things vividly and directly as a child sees them, and for the general drabness of our lives. Wow, ouchie. Man, continued Ouspensky, is not only a machine, but a machine which works very much below the standard it would be capable of maintaining if it were working properly. It is necessary for us, therefore, to observe ourselves very closely, not only in order to obtain knowledge of our mechanism, but also in order that we may realize how much better our machinery might be made to work. There are many defects which are common to us all as ordinary human beings, and there are also forms of bad working which are peculiar to ourselves individually. In this preliminary stage of self-study, it is necessary that we should become thoroughly familiar with our own particular failings, end quote. And I don't know if anyone can access the Fourth Way PDF. I could probably do it if everyone really wants to know, but there's a wonderful analogy in Ouspensky's The Fourth Way where he says the human machine, the human being can work as an aeroplane, but in our present state we use it like a horse and carriage. There's a tractor or a car dragging the aeroplane around. And that's obviously a very low level. Then he says, in fact, I'm going to find it so that you can go and listen to it if you like. Then you can turn the engine on and drive it around like a car. But still, it's not working at its full capacity. Only when you take off, I don't know what you'd call that, when you use it to its full capacity and start the engines, find a runway to take off and fly, do you use it in its full capacity? Well, here we go. Let me read it for you. If you don't mind, I'm going to digress and read this passage because Ouspensky, of course, can say it better than me. What chapter are we in? Chapter 2. It is very important to understand what is a complete being and what is an incomplete being, because if this is not understood from the beginning, it will be difficult to go further. Perhaps an example will help to illustrate what I mean. Let us compare a horse carriage with an aeroplane. An aeroplane has many possibilities that an ordinary carriage does not have, but at the same time an aeroplane can be used as an ordinary carriage. It would be very clumsy and inconvenient and very expensive, but you can attach 2 horses to it and travel in an aeroplane by road. Suppose the man who had this aeroplane does not know that it has an engine and can move by itself, and suppose he learns about the engine. Then he can dispense with the horses and use it as a motor car. But it will still be too clumsy. Suppose that the man studies this machine and discovers that it can fly. Certainly it will have many advantages which he missed when he used the aeroplane as a carriage. This is what we are doing with ourselves. We use ourselves as a carriage when we could fly. But examples are one thing and facts are another. There is no need of allegories and analogies, for we can speak about actual facts if we begin to study consciousness in the right way. And again, that's from chapter 2 of Ouspensky's The Fourth Way, and I thought it's rather apt and related to this section. As I said earlier in this chapter, the idea that man has other minds than the single mind which the physiologists have linked with his brain and central nervous system made a strong appeal to me. Moreover, all that Ouspensky was now saying about the ability of one centre to take on the work of another centre was fully in accord with my personal experience. I could recall how long ago, in learning to ride a bicycle, my moving centre had, at a certain moment, taken over the work which had been performed up till then by my intellectual centre. At the beginning of the lessons, an immense amount of thought had to be directed to the way in which body weight was distributed, and if my attention had been allowed to stray for a moment from this task of balancing myself and of turning the handlebars in the right direction, I promptly tumbled over. And you can all think back, if you can drive, think back when you were a beginner, how you had to really use the conscious mind, clutch in, gear, clutch out smooth, accelerator, 10 to 2 hands. And then later on, that moves into the subconscious or the moving center, and you can drive all the way to work daydreaming about whatever. So the conscious activity, the intellectual center driving very consciously and mechanically, and then it's seeping into the subconscious to the moving center, and one can drive seemingly like the car's an extension. Then, quite suddenly, all this thinking and scheming became unnecessary, and I found myself riding a bicycle and balancing myself as though to the manner born. Something within me had suddenly assumed responsibility for the whole business of riding a bicycle, and the something which had relieved the head of its previous work was clearly my moving centre. I could recall also the abrupt change which had taken place in my mode of speaking Spanish when I was living in Buenos Aires. Up till a certain dramatic moment, much thinking had been required for talking in Spanish, and what I had really been doing all the time was translating painfully from English into Spanish. Then, within the space of a week, a marked change occurred, and I found myself thinking and dreaming in Spanish. All need for translating had gone, and my moving centre was mimicking everybody around me and doing much of the work previously performed by my intellectual centre. And I do speak a bit of Spanish, but of course I'm nowhere near there. I am still, what I want to say it in English. Have I got the words? Often not. Try. Most of the time I'll need a dictionary to find a word or two, unless it's of course a very simple sentence. But I know many speakers, bilingual speakers, multilingual speakers, begin to think in a language. So, yeah, another interesting example, right? Riding a bike, driving a car, speaking a language, and of course there's many other examples I'm sure you can come up with by yourself. Like other people, I had some difficulty at first in distinguishing between instinctive movements and movements carried out by moving centre, but Ouspensky had helped us greatly by saying that instinctive movements were inborn, whilst moving centre movements had to be learnt. Again, another very interesting concept. Instinctive movements were inborn, whilst moving centre movements had to be learnt. For example, the newborn infant knew how to breathe from the very start and quickly learned to suck and to swallow, but the art of walking had to be acquired painfully at a later date. Ouspensky also said that each center possessed its own form of memory, and I recalled the surprise which I had felt on discovering that, although I had not ridden a bicycle for over 20 years, I was still able to leap onto a machine and to pedal off without thought or difficulty. My moving center had remembered the technique of bicycle riding all that time. Bicycle riding also illustrated what Ouspensky had said about one center interfering with another. If, after moving center had taken over the responsibility for bicycle riding, I suppose he could use the word cycling, I don't know why he's saying bicycle riding, had taken over the responsibility for bicycle riding, one started to think about it and to work out intellectually how the weight should be distributed and in which direction the handlebars should be turned, one was likely to have a spill. And this was a clear instance of intellectual center interfering with moving center. And if you want another example of that, and I'll say at your own discretion, can be quite dangerous. So, warning, don't just do it willy-nilly. And I would say only do it going up the stairs, not coming down the stairs. If, when you're walking up the stairs, you try and become conscious of the way your feet are moving, try and consciously do it, you'll realize it will be an intense impression and you may trip and stumble, which is why you do it only going up the stairs. So you'll fall onto the stairs, not coming down the stairs. So another experiment to do, right? Don't listen to me and believe me. Try it. When you're going up the stairs and you have a moment of awareness, self-remembering, try and engage the intellectual center. See what happens, but be very careful. I don't want to be sued for, I don't know what it would be, for injury, damages. So, again, at your own discretion and carefully. There was an interesting connection also between G's ideas of memory and instinctive center and Samuel Butler's view that instinct in animals and even heredity as a whole are the result of inherited memories. Interesting. I need to look up Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler protested against what he called shearing the thread of life and hence of memory between one generation and its successor. According to him, our bodies inherit memories from a long line of ancestors, memories which are carried across the gap between successive generations by the ovum and the spermatozoon. And I believe also Rupert Sheldrake has a concept, morphic resonance, and he gives the example, morphic resonance, a band of monkeys or apes in one part of the world can use a stone to open nuts and even fish with a stick, and a band of apes and monkeys the other side of the world that never got taught by those monkeys began to do it as well. Morphic resonance. And also, so Rupert Sheldrake and Samuel Butler, if you're interested in that biological side of things, the animals and what does he call it? Memories, ancestral memory transmission, maybe you could call it. He gave as an example of inherited memory the fact that at a certain age of its development within the egg, the chick remembered that it had to tap with its beak on the inner side of the eggshell in order to break out into the world. Not only did the chick remember how to do this, but at a still earlier stage of its development, its instinctive center had recalled in time the need for developing certain very hard cells at the tip of its beak, in order that it might be able to break the shell, and having remembered this, it had promptly proceeded to do what was required of it. Heredity, therefore, was for Samuel Butler a manifestation of racial memory, a theory of his which had always fascinated me. And here was G supporting Samuel Butler by speaking of a memory and instinctive center which regulated all physiological and growth processes. It was true that since the days of Weissman, scientists had been of the opinion that characteristics acquired by the parents are never handed down to the offspring, but I had always been skeptical of Weissman's arguments. At heart I had always remained a heretic, a Lamarckian, and an admirer of Butler. So maybe a video on Samuel Butler and Gurdjieff coming up. And also, what do they call it? Epigenetics, I think, is another term. The genetics are what you receive from mum and dad, and then the epigenetics are like conditional, environmental. Again, I think could be talking out of my behind, but epigenetics, I'm sure it's something similar, but don't quote me. I was surprised at the richness of the haul of observations I made during the next few weeks by observing myself in the way Ouspensky had advised, as though taking stock of some other person with whom I was only slightly acquainted. And again, proper self-observation will have that impression. Who is this person? Who's this guy? Perhaps the earliest and most disquieting of the findings made in this way was that I was never the same for more than a few minutes, and yet I had the effrontery to preface many of my remarks with such misleading phrases, "I always think that," or "I'm convinced that," or "I feel strongly that." What nonsense! I realize now that frequently I had thought and felt quite differently from the way in which I was thinking and feeling at that particular moment. And who was it that was making this dogmatic statement about his own thoughts and feelings? Who, in short, was I? Here was a problem of the first magnitude to be faced. Self-observation gave rise to a host of new questions. Over 2,000 years ago, Heraclitus proclaimed that everything flowed, and up till that moment I had imagined that, in uttering these well-known words, he was referring only to the world outside ourselves. Now, as the result of only 3 months' self-observation, I realized that what was undoubtedly true of the world outside myself was equally true of the world within me. Everything flowed within me as it flowed without me. One inner state quickly followed another, a feeling of pleasure quickly being replaced by one of displeasure, so that when I looked within, it seemed to me that my various emotions were playing a game of family coach, all changing places. A study of these two flowings, the inner and the outer, soon convinced me that the inner was of far greater importance to me than the outer, so far as the business of living was concerned. Yet it was the instability of the outer world that I always blamed whenever anything went wrong with my life, and never the instability within me. It was the same with other people. They were always struggling to alter things outside themselves without ever realizing the much more urgent need to change the world within. All would be folly if only A, B, and C would behave differently, if the law were altered, if people were not such fools, if certain things were done which ought to be done, but they never stopped for a moment to look within at the great current of life, partly conscious but still more unconscious, which was carrying them along, as an incoming tide sweeps in on its surface fragments of wreckage and seaweed. According to Sigmund Freud, what we do, what we feel, and what we think are but the byproducts of those dark and dynamic regions of the mind in which lie all our primitive animal instincts. And Freud gives us quite a good account of the subconscious mind responsible for all these activities in us. But the best description of this great underground river of desires, thoughts, and feelings are to be found in the much earlier works of the Cambridge Neoplatonists, written about a century ago. The Cambridge Neoplatonists? What are they doing in Cambridge? In 1866, E.S. Dallas gave the following dramatic description of the surge of life in the poorly lit caverns of the mind. Quote, "In the dark recesses of memory, in unbidden suggestions, in trains of thought unwittingly pursued, in multiplied waves and currents all at once flashing and rushing, in dreams that cannot be laid, in the force of instinct, we have glimpses of a great tide of life, ebbing and flowing, rippling and rolling and beating about, where we cannot see it." And that's quoted by Michael Roberts in The Modern Mind. No better description could be given of the force which carries us along with it, a force of life, of whose existence I was now becoming dimly aware. And that, my friends, I'm sorry to say, I could go on reading all night, but, excuse me, I have the day job in the morning, and so I can't read all night as much as I would like to. And as you could probably tell if you're here, still I am enjoying that very much. As much as one can enjoy a book, I would argue. And I hope to continue enjoying it tomorrow. But again, it didn't disappoint, did it? Just as Maurice Nicoll, highly practical, the same. Kenneth Walker, very practical, lots of examples, and then I chip in my examples, also my experiences of work, and hopefully that's helpful for you. But brilliant in the sense of examples, practical, down to earth, no mystical words and highfalutin metaphysics, but also quite the character, isn't he? How he writes, I just love it. And so chapter 3 tomorrow, man is asleep, and then knowledge and being, and we'll be about a third or a quarter of the way through, and we'll be flying. And then, as I've said, after that we will read Gurdjieff's Views from the Real World, which contains Glimpses of Truth, which is an essay about an individual's first meeting with Gurdjieff in a rather lengthy lengthy essay, I would say. So, yes, any comments, get them in before I shut the stream down. But it's been wonderful to share this with you. As you probably saw, and as I've just said, and I'm saying again, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Too much, maybe, if that's possible, but I don't think it is, and I won't be told otherwise. But one final thing before we go. As he says earlier, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find the passage, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try quite hard, actually, so, yeah. But am I going to succeed? A book, I found it. A book is but a poor substitute for such vital and direct teaching as this. It's a poor substitute, but it's a wonderful substitute. That's my opinion, and I will accept any arguments that counter it, but I'm afraid the books are wonderful substitutes, and ultimately it's Kenneth Walker, his thoughts that he's put down on the paper, published in the book. I'm reading them and saying them. So one could even say I am evoking Kenneth Walker. He lived in England. I don't know if there's recordings of his voice, but again, if I could do an impression of Kenneth Walker, then he could be talking to you, right? Sorry, I'm getting a bit carried away. But Lynn Elliott says, all very helpful and interesting, Lewis. I would agree very much. And J.K. Techers, thank you very much for the reading, Lewis. It's a pleasure, and it's nice to see you back, J.K. Techers. Like I say, reach out, let me know how you're doing if you care to. But it's good to see you back, and welcome. And that's all I've got to say for now. I could ramble on, as always, forever, but I won't. I'll say goodbye. Thanks for joining and for your time and attention, because really, in essence, that's amongst the most precious things we have in this modern world, our time and our attention. And so I'm very grateful that you chose to spend them here this evening, and we'll be back tomorrow for 2 more chapters, and even tomorrow afternoon when I get home from work to read another of Maurice Nicol's commentaries, and I will give you the exact title rather than trying to paraphrase it and guess. It is called A Commentary on the Relationship of a Man to Himself. So very similar to some of the things that we encountered in that reading. Letitia, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I agree, it was a great reading. Thanks to Kenneth Walker. Jordan, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow. I do hope so. And Carlos, you're very welcome. It's my pleasure. And I really enjoy nothing more than sharing these great works here on the channel. And I look forward to continue that tomorrow. But for now, thanks again for joining. Take care, look after yourselves, and if I don't see you, have a great week full of mindfulness and presence and awakening. But hopefully I see you tomorrow. Excuse me, a loud burp to end the stream there. That wouldn't go down well, would it? But anyway, take care. Whatever you're up to, whether you're streaming here, coming to the streams, whether you're not, whatever you're doing, take care, look after yourselves, and I do hope to see you very soon. Bye now.